My wife imprisoned me beneath our own home for 20 years so she could live openly with her lover. The day I was freed, the woman who stole my life discovered that she hadn't buried a husband, she had incubated a monster. Meredith stood at the threshold of the panic room, her blonde braids swaying as she looked back at me one last time, her face a mask of cold calculation rather than love. She didn't offer an apology. She just slid the heavy gold padlocks into place, one by one, sealing me in darkness. Those clicks sentenced me to 7,300 days of isolation in a soundproof bunker. 20 years of my life stolen by the lie that I was an embezzler on the run. But the truth was waiting for her in the walls of the estate she stole, and my return would be far more devastating than the concrete cell she left me to rot in. Quick thing, where are you watching from? Comment below. And if stories of betrayal and survival pull you in, subscribe and like now. This story starts right now. The roast duck was perfect. The vintage Cabernet breathed in crystal decanters, and the candlelight danced off the diamond necklace I had bought Meredith for our 15th anniversary. From the outside, the Sterling estate was a fortress of domestic bliss, a testament to the empire I had built with code and silicon. But sitting at the head of that long mahogany table, I felt a cold draft that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I was a man of patterns. My entire career as a tech innovator was built on recognizing anomalies in data, little glitches that signaled a system failure. And for the last 6 months, my marriage had been glitching. "You're barely eating, Elias," Meredith said, her voice smooth as polished glass. She sat opposite me, her intricate blonde braids resting against the silk of her robe. She looked ethereal, the picture of a devoted wife, but her eyes remained fixed on the silverware she was arranging with unnecessary precision. "I'm just tired," I lied, pushing the food around my plate. "The audit is taking more out of me than I expected." Meredith's hand paused over her wine glass. "The audit? I thought you said the accounts were balanced." "They are," I said, finally looking up to meet her gaze. "Mostly. But I found a series of transfers today, significant ones. Nearly $5 million moved to a shell company in the Caymans, a company registered to a man named Dane." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I watched her closely, expecting shock, maybe confusion. I expected her to ask who Dane was or if we had been hacked. Instead, she just smiled, a small, tight curving of her lips that didn't reach her eyes. "You always were too smart for your own good, Elias," she sighed, reaching for the decanter. "It's a flaw, really. You never know when to just let things be." "Meredith, this isn't about letting things be. Someone is stealing from us. If there's a breach—" "There's no breach," she interrupted softly, rising from her chair. She walked around the length of the table, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves. She stopped behind me, her hands resting on my shoulders, her fingers kneading the tension there. "Relax, darling. I handled it. It's an investment, a surprise." She poured a measure of amber liquid into my tumbler, my favorite 25-year-old single malt. "Drink. We'll discuss the portfolio in the morning. Tonight, I just want my husband back." I was a pacifist by nature, a man who avoided conflict at all costs. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the woman who had borne my children, the woman I had worshipped for 2 decades, was incapable of deceit. So I lifted the glass. I didn't taste the bitterness until the liquid was already burning down my throat. It wasn't the oaky bite of the scotch. It was something metallic, chemical. "Meredith," I choked, the glass slipping from my numb fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor. The room tilted violently, the candlelight smeared into long, blinding streaks. I tried to stand, but my legs had turned to water. I slumped back into the chair, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Meredith stepped back, watching me with a clinical detachment, like a scientist observing a specimen in a jar. She didn't call for help, she didn't scream, she simply checked her watch. It takes about 90 minutes to fully metabolize, but the paralysis is almost instant. "Why?" I rasped, my tongue heavy and useless in my mouth. "Because I'm tired of waiting, Elias. I'm tired of playing the doting wife to a bore who thinks excitement is a new algorithm. She leaned in close, her perfume cloying and sweet. And Dane? He's not an investment. He's the future, and he's expensive. I tried to grab her, to fight, but my arms hung limp at my sides. My vision grayed at the edges. I was conscious, terrified, but completely trapped within my own body. Then he walked in. Dane. I recognized him instantly. He was the personal trainer Meredith had hired last summer. Younger, arrogant, with a cruel set to his jaw. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me like I was furniture that needed to be moved. He's heavier than he looks, Dane grunted as he hoisted me out of the chair. They dragged me through the house I paid for, past the family photos on the wall, past the door to my son's bedroom. I wanted to scream Julian's name to wake the house, but only a low gurgle escaped my throat. They didn't take me to the garage. They didn't take me to the woods. They took me to the pantry. Behind the wine racks, there was a concealed door leading to the panic room, a reinforced underground bunker I had installed after the '01 terror scares. I had built it to keep my family safe. I had designed the ventilation, the soundproofing, the impenetrable steel door. I had built my own tomb. Dane dumped me onto the cold concrete floor of the bunker. The impact jarred my bones, but I couldn't move to cushion the fall. I lay there, staring up at the fluorescent strip light flickering overhead, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Meredith stood in the doorway. She looked stunning and terrifying, the light from the hallway casting her shadow long over my paralyzed body. She looked back at me, her expression devoid of the warmth I had known for 20 years. It was the look of a stranger. "Don't worry, Elias," she said, her hand resting on the heavy steel lever of the door. "I'll make sure you're fed. I need you alive to sign the power of attorney transfers when the drugs wear off. After that, well, you have plenty of time to think about where you went wrong." "Meredith," I tried to say, but it came out as a whimper. She didn't blink. She grabbed the heavy gold padlocks we kept for the emergency supply crates. "Goodbye, Elias," she said. She pulled the door shut. The sound was the loudest thing I had ever heard, a boom that vibrated through the floor, followed by the grinding of steel bolts engaging. Then the click. 1 lock, 2 locks, 3. The silence that followed was absolute. I was 20 feet underground, encased in concrete, paralyzed and alone. Above me, my wife was pouring another glass of wine for her lover. My life as Elias Sterling didn't end with a funeral. It ended with the click of a padlock, leaving me in the dark to count the seconds of a nightmare that would last for 20 years. Time dissolved into a shapeless gray fog. I didn't know how long I lay on the concrete floor after the drugs were off. Hours, maybe a day. The paralysis receded slowly, replaced by a stinging pins and needles sensation that made every movement an agony. When I finally dragged myself to a sitting position, my first instinct wasn't to scream, but to assess. The panic room was exactly as I had designed it. 20 by 20 feet, reinforced concrete walls, a backup generator, air filtration, and a bathroom unit. I had built it to survive a nuclear winter. I never imagined the fallout would come from upstairs. The silence was broken by a static hiss. Mounted high in the corner, the security monitor, intended to show the occupants of the panic room the safety of the outside world, flickered to life. Meredith's face filled the screen. She wasn't in the basement. She was in my study, sitting at my desk. The camera angle was slightly high, likely from the webcam on my laptop. She wasn't looking at me, though. She was busy. I watched, mesmerized by the horror of her efficiency as she dismantled my life. She wore latex gloves, the kind we kept under the sink for cleaning. With methodical precision, she opened my private safe. I had never given her the combination, which meant she had either watched me enter it or, more likely, had been planning this for months and used a thermal camera to trace the heat signature of my fingers on the keypad. She pulled out my passport, my birth certificate, and the emergency cash stash, about $50,000. She didn't take them. She dropped them into a black duffel bag sitting on the floor. Then came the files. She pulled a stack of documents from a folder I didn't recognize. She fanned them out across the mahogany surface of the desk, bank transfers, routing numbers, offshore incorporation papers. She picked up my favorite fountain pen, uncapped it, and practiced a few strokes on a scrap piece of paper. Then, without a tremor in her hand, she began signing my name, Elias Sterling, Elias Sterling, Elias Sterling. "You're watching, aren't you?" Her voice came through the small speaker, tinny and distorted. She didn't look up from her forgery. She knew the system better than I thought. She had likely enabled the remote link. "It has to be convincing, Elias," she murmured, signing a transfer authorization for $10 million. "People won't believe you just ran away. A man like you, a man with a god complex, you wouldn't leave your empire unless you were forced to, unless you were a criminal." She finished the paperwork and placed it prominently in the center of the desk. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached for the framed photograph of us, me, Meredith, and 5-year-old Julian, that sat near the computer. She smashed it face down onto the desk. The glass shattered. "Scene set," she whispered. The screen went black, only to flicker back on hours later. This time, the feed wasn't from my laptop. It was a cable news broadcast. The banner at the bottom screamed in urgent red. "Tech mogul missing. Allegations of massive fraud." I sat cross-legged on the floor of my cell, trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go, as I watched the police tape crisscrossing the front door of my home. The reporters stood on my lawn, breathless. Authorities have confirmed that Elias Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, has not been seen for 48 hours. Sources inside the investigation reveal that a massive discrepancy was discovered in the company's funds late Thursday night. It appears Mr. Sterling may have fled the country to avoid federal prosecution. The camera cut to a press conference set up in the driveway, and there she was. Meredith stood before a phalanx of microphones, dressed in black, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked shattered. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She clutched a handkerchief to her chest, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice breaking perfectly. "Elias has been distant lately, paranoid. He kept talking about money, about needing to get away. I thought it was just stress. I told him we could work through anything." She paused, wiping a tear that tracked down her cheek. "I woke up 2 days ago and he was gone. His passport, his clothes, gone. And then the police showed me the files in his study." She looked directly into the camera lens, and I knew she was looking at me, down in the dark. "Elias, you're watching, aren't you?" Her voice came through the small speaker, tinny and distorted. She didn't look up from her forgery. She knew the system better than I thought. She had likely enabled the remote link. "It has to be convincing, Elias," she murmured, signing a transfer authorization for $10 million. "People won't believe you just ran away. A man like you, a man with a god complex, you wouldn't leave your empire unless you were forced to, unless you were a criminal." She finished the paperwork and placed it prominently in the center of the desk. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached for the framed photograph of us, me, Meredith, and 5-year-old Julian, that sat near the computer. She smashed it face down onto the desk. The glass shattered. "Scene set," she whispered. The screen went black, only to flicker back on hours later. This time, the feed wasn't from my laptop. It was a cable news broadcast. The banner at the bottom screamed in urgent red. "Tech mogul missing. Allegations of massive fraud." I sat cross-legged on the floor of my cell, trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go, as I watched the police tape crisscrossing the front door of my home. The reporters stood on my lawn, breathless. Authorities have confirmed that Elias Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, has not been seen for 48 hours. Sources inside the investigation reveal that a massive discrepancy was discovered in the company's funds late Thursday night. It appears Mr. Sterling may have fled the country to avoid federal prosecution. The camera cut to a press conference set up in the driveway, and there she was. Meredith stood before a phalanx of microphones, dressed in black, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked shattered. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She clutched a handkerchief to her chest, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. I I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice breaking perfectly. Elias has been distant lately, paranoid. He kept talking about money, about needing to get away. I thought it was just stress. I told him we could work through anything. She paused, wiping a tear that tracked down her cheek. I woke up 2 days ago and he was gone. His passport, his clothes, gone. And then the police showed me the files in his study. She looked directly into the camera lens, and I knew she was looking at me, down in the dark. Elias, you're watching, aren't you? Her voice came through the small speaker, tinny and distorted. She didn't look up from her forgery. She knew the system better than I thought. She had likely enabled the remote link. It has to be convincing, Elias, she murmured, signing a transfer authorization for $10 million. People won't believe you just ran away. A man like you, a man with a god complex, you wouldn't leave your empire unless you were forced to, unless you were a criminal. She finished the paperwork and placed it prominently in the center of the desk. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached for the framed photograph of us, me, Meredith, and 5-year-old Julian, that sat near the computer. She smashed it face down onto the desk. The glass shattered. Scene set, she whispered. The screen went black, only to flicker back on hours later. This time, the feed wasn't from my laptop. It was a cable news broadcast. The banner at the bottom screamed in urgent red. Tech mogul missing. Allegations of massive fraud. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my cell, trembling with a rage that had nowhere to go, as I watched the police tape crisscrossing the front door of my home. The reporter stood on my lawn, breathless. Authorities have confirmed that Elias Sterling, CEO of Sterling Dynamics, has not been seen for 48 hours. Sources inside the investigation reveal that a massive discrepancy was discovered in the company's funds late Thursday night. It appears Mr. Sterling may have fled the country to avoid federal prosecution. The camera cut to a press conference set up in the driveway, and there she was. Meredith stood before a phalanx of microphones, dressed in black, her face devoid of makeup, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. She looked shattered. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She clutched a handkerchief to her chest, her hand trembling just enough to catch the light. I don't know what to say, she stammered, her voice breaking perfectly. Elias has been distant lately, paranoid. He kept talking about money, about needing to get away. I thought it was just stress. I told him we could work through anything. She paused, wiping a tear that tracked down her cheek. I woke up 2 days ago and he was gone. His passport, his clothes, gone. And then the police showed me the files in his study. She looked directly into the camera lens, and I knew she was looking at me, down in the dark. Elias, you're watching, aren't you? Her voice came through the small speaker, tinny and distorted. She didn't look up from her forgery. She knew the system better than I thought. She had likely enabled the remote link. It has to be convincing, Elias, she murmured, signing a transfer authorization for $10 million. People won't believe you just ran away. A man like you, a man with a god complex, you wouldn't leave your empire unless you were forced to, unless you were a criminal. She finished the paperwork and placed it prominently in the center of the desk. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached for the framed photograph of us, me, Meredith, and 5-year-old. The ceiling of my cell was 12 inches of reinforced concrete, but to a man with nothing to do but listen, it might as well have been parchment. In the first year, I learned the language of the house above me. I learned that the water pipes groaned in B-flat when the master bath was filling, and that the HVAC system hiccuped exactly 3 minutes before the boiler kicked on. But mostly, I learned the footsteps. Meredith's were sharp, rhythmic staccatos, the click-clock of heels on hardwood, efficient and terrifying. But soon, a new rhythm took over the house. Heavy, dragging thuds. Arrogant, leisurely steps that didn't care about the finish of the floors. Dane had moved in. It started with the demolition. About 3 months into my confinement, the vibrations began. It wasn't just noise, it was a physical assault. The jackhammers rattled the fillings in my teeth and sent dust motes dancing in the sterile light of my bunker. I lay on my cot, my hands pressed over my ears, trying to visualize the map of the house I had built. They were directly above me. They were tearing apart the library. My library. That room had been my sanctuary, lined with first editions and the smell of old paper and leather. It was where I had taught Julian to play chess. Now I listened to the screech of prying bars ripping up the hand-laid mahogany floorboards. I heard the crash of heavy shelving being toppled. They weren't just renovating, they were erasing. Every crash above was a deliberate strike against my memory, a dismantling of the taste and intellect I had tried to cultivate in that home. Sometimes the security monitor would flicker on, Meredith's favorite way to torture me without getting her hands dirty. She showed me the progress. The warm, dark wood of my study was replaced with cold, clinical marble. My antique desk, the one my grandfather left me, was gone, replaced by a glass monstrosity that looked like a jagged shard of ice. "It's so much more open now, don't you think?" Meredith's voice filtered through the speakers one afternoon. She was standing in the middle of the wreckage holding a glass of champagne. Dane was behind her, shirtless, sweating from the exertion of destroying my life with a sledgehammer. "Elias always liked it so dark," she continued, addressing the air, knowing I was watching. "So claustrophobic. We need light, Dane. We need to breathe." Dane laughed, a low, guttural sound. "Cost a fortune to import this stone, Mare. You sure the embezzler left enough behind?" "Oh, there's plenty," she purred, turning to kiss him. "He was very good at making money. He just didn't know how to enjoy it." I watched them toast with my crystal in the ruin of my sanctuary. The rage that had been a roaring fire in my gut began to cool into something harder, denser, a diamond of hate. Once the construction stopped, the parties began. I became the ghost beneath the floorboards, the uninvited guest at the feast. I knew it was Friday night because the bass would start. It wasn't music to me. It was a rhythmic thumping that pressurized the air in my cell. I could feel the beat in my sternum. I imagined the scene above. The local elite, my former colleagues, the neighbors who had once shaken my hand, they were all there. I could hear the muffled roar of conversation, the shrill peals of laughter that pierced through the soundproofing. They were drinking my liquor, eating food paid for with the patents I had designed, dancing on the marble that covered my grave. Did they ask about me? Did anyone swirl their wine and ask, "Whatever happened to poor Elias?" Or was I just a cautionary tale, a snippet of gossip to spice up the evening? He stole millions, abandoned his wife. Such a tragedy for Meredith. One night, the party was particularly raucous. The thumping overhead was erratic, wild. I sat at my small metal table, staring at the ceiling, tracking the movement of the herd. Then the footsteps stopped. The music cut out. A heavy silence fell, followed by a singular loud voice. It was Dane. I could tell by the slur and the exaggerated volume. "To the ghost," he bellowed. A ripple of nervous laughter filtered down. "Come on, drink up," Dane shouted. "To the man who made all this possible. To the man who checked out so I could check in." The room above erupted in cheers. Cheers! They were toasting my demise. They were celebrating the man who was paying for the party while he rotted 20 feet beneath their Ferragamos. Then came the stomping. It started with Dane. Thump, thump, thump. Rhythmic, heavy jumps directly on the spot where the trapdoor was hidden under a rug and the new marble flooring. Then others joined. It became a tribal dance, a collective act of desecration. The dust on my ceiling shook. The light fixture swayed. They were dancing on my head. I didn't scream this time. I didn't cry. I sat perfectly still, my hands clasped together, my breathing steady. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound. I memorized the weight of Dane's steps. I memorized the cadence of his laugh. I let the vibrations travel through the floor, down the walls and into my bones. Enjoy it, I thought, a cold smile touching my lips for the first time in months. Renovate the house, buy the cars, drink the wine, make it perfect, because they were just keeping it warm for me. Every dollar they spent was a receipt I would tally. Every party they threw was evidence I would use. They thought they were living the high life on the grave of Elias Sterling. But they were wrong. They were just the caretakers, and the landlord was listening. Time is not a straight line when you are buried alive. It is a stagnant pool, thick and suffocating. The first 5 years were not years at all, but a single, unending scream trapped in the back of my throat. I lost track of the days somewhere around month 6, when the generator flickered and reset the digital clock on the microwave. Without the sun, without the moon, I was adrift in a sea of artificial light and absolute silence, punctuated only by the cruel rhythms of the house above. I began to unravel. It started with the hallucinations. I would see Julian sitting in the corner, playing with his blocks. I would reach for him, desperate to feel the warmth of his small hand, but my fingers would brush against the cold, damp concrete, and he would dissolve into gray mist. I forgot the sound of my own voice. I forgot the color of the sky. I spent weeks lying on the mattress, staring at a water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like a map of the world, tracing imaginary escape routes that always ended at the steel door. The despair was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest until my ribs ached. I stopped eating the canned food Meredith sent down via the dumbwaiter. I stopped washing. I became a creature of the dark, waiting for the inevitable organ failure that would finally set me free. I wanted to die. I prayed for a gas leak, a fire, anything to end the monotony of the heartbeat thudding in my ears. But the mind is a stubborn thing. It refuses to shut down even when you beg it to. It was in the depths of the 7th year, as I lay shivering in the fetal position, that I noticed the pattern on the floor, the dust motes dancing in the beam of the emergency light. They weren't random. They moved in convection currents, dictated by the heat of the vent. Fluid dynamics, variables, an equation. I sat up. My muscles were atrophied, my skin pale and translucent as a cavefish, but a spark ignited in the dead circuitry of my brain. Meredith had taken my freedom, my family, and my name, but she hadn't taken the logic. She hadn't taken the math. I found a loose, jagged screw on the underside of the metal bed frame. It was small, sharp, and hard enough to scratch the concrete walls. I started near the bathroom unit. E to the I pi plus 1 equals 0. Euler's identity, the most beautiful equation in the universe. It was the first mark I made, a declaration of existence. I think, therefore I am. From that day on, the wall became my canvas and my savior. I didn't just write equations, I rebuilt the world in numbers. I calculated the structural load of the bunker. I derived the flow rate of the ventilation system based on the hum of the fans. I spent 6 months proving the Riemann hypothesis, covering an entire wall with dense, scratching script, my fingers bleeding and calloused, my mind soaring high above the prison. The variables kept the madness at bay. When the depression tried to claw its way back in, I forced it into a box of calculus. When the rage threatened to consume me, I channeled it into geometry. I wasn't rotting anymore. I was processing. As my mind sharpened, I realized my body had to follow. I couldn't be a brain in a jar. If I ever got out, and for the first time in a decade, I allowed myself the dangerous luxury of if, I needed to be able to walk. I needed to be able to fight. I started with 1 push-up. I collapsed, trembling, my weak arms unable to hold my own weight. But the next day, I did 2, then 5, then 10. The years began to compress, gaining a rhythm of their own. The era of despair gave way to the era of preparation. My routine became religious. Wake up, calculate, exercise, eat, calculate, exercise, sleep. I treated the bunker not as a cell, but as a hyperbolic time chamber. I did thousands of burpees until sweat pooled on the floor, slick and salty. I did pull-ups on the exposed piping until my back rippled with lean, corded muscle. I wasn't building a beach body. I was building a weapon. I stripped away the soft, doughy tech CEO who had sat at a desk for 20 years, and underneath, I found something primal. I also began to study them. The ceiling was no longer a barrier. It was a transmitter. I cataloged their lives through the vibrations. I knew that in year 12, Dane developed a limp, the heavy thud drag of his right foot indicating a knee injury, likely from skiing or one of the expensive hobbies my money funded. I knew Meredith's alcoholism had escalated. The clinking of bottles in the recycling chute became a daily avalanche around 4 p.m. I heard their arguments, the muffled shouting matches that grew more frequent as the money, my money, began to dwindle or the novelty of their affair wore off. I analyzed the acoustics of their discord. I predicted their fights based on the season and the time of day. I knew them better than they knew themselves. I wasn't Elias the victim anymore. I was Elias the observer, the watcher in the deep. By the time the 20th year approached, the walls of my cell were completely covered in white scratches, a chaotic, beautiful tapestry of high-level mathematics, physics, and probability models. A stranger seeing it would think it the work of a madman, but it wasn't madness. It was a map of survival. I stood in the center of the room, naked from the waist up, my beard long and gray, my body scarred and wiry. I looked at the surveillance camera, the unblinking eye of my tormentor. I didn't scream at it anymore. I didn't plead. I simply stared into the lens with a calm, terrifying patience. I had solved every problem the room could offer. I had calculated every variable of my confinement. There was only one variable left in the equation, one unpredictable element that chaos theory dictated must eventually occur. A mistake. They would make a mistake. Entropy affects all closed systems. The house was decaying. Their relationship was decaying. The machinery keeping me here was decaying. I placed my hand on the wall, feeling the rough texture of the concrete under my palm, tracing the symbol for infinity I had carved near the door. I was ready. The soft pacifist who had sipped wine at the dinner table was dead. In his place stood a man forged in the dark, a man who turned time into a blade. I took a deep breath of the stale, recycled air and waited for the glitch. The glitch I had prayed for didn't arrive with a bang, but with a whimper. It happened on the morning of my 7,304th day, just as I was finishing my set of handstand push-ups against the north wall. For 20 years, the silence of my tomb had been masked by the constant low-frequency thrum of the air filtration system, the mechanical lungs that kept me alive. It was a sound so omnipresent that it had become part of my own heartbeat. And then it stopped. The motor ceased with a dying grind, followed by a hiss of depressurization. The sudden silence was deafening, heavier than the concrete above. I froze, sweat dripping from my nose onto the floor, my pulse hammering in my ears. I waited for the backup kicked in. I counted the seconds. 1, 2, 10, 60. Nothing. The auxiliary generator hummed, keeping the lights on, but the air intake, the lifeline that snaked up through 20 feet of earth to the surface, was dead. I knew the schematics. I had designed them. The intake valve was camouflaged inside a decorative stone folly in the garden, hidden amidst Meredith's prize-winning hydrangeas. If the fan belt had snapped or the intake was clogged with debris, the CO2 levels in the bunker would rise to lethal levels within 48 hours. I didn't panic. Panic burns oxygen. I sat on my cot and slowed my breathing, entering a meditative trance. This was it. The variable, the failure of the system. Above me, Meredith and Dane would be hearing a warning buzzer on the control panel in the master bedroom. They had a choice: call a specialized technician and risk exposing their secret, or try to fix it cheaply and quietly. I bet my life on Dane's arrogance. 2 floors up and 20 yards of manicured lawn away, Dane stood on the patio swirling his mid-morning Bloody Mary. He was older now, his face puffy from 2 decades of easy living and expensive scotch, the cruelty in his jawline softened by jowls. He glared at the stone folly in the garden. The buzzing alarm in the bedroom had been giving him a migraine for an hour. "It's just a blocked pipe, Meredith," he had snapped earlier, dismissing her concerns. "I'm not paying that specialized firm 10 grand to come out here and ask questions about why we have an industrial ventilator buried in the rose garden. I'll handle it." Handling it meant hiring the cheapest labor he could find on short notice. Leo wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a grime-streaked glove. He was 22, lean and sunburnt, working 3 gigs just to pay for community college. He didn't know who the Sterlings were, and he didn't care. He just knew the guy in the linen suit was watching him like a hawk, and that the job was digging a trench around some weird stone structure to check for drainage issues. "Careful with the roots," Dane barked from the shade of the patio umbrella. "Those hydrangeas are worth more than your truck." "Yes, sir," Leo muttered, driving his shovel back into the hard-packed earth. He was 4 feet down when his shovel hit something hard. It wasn't rock, it was metal. A hollow, resonant clang that vibrated up the handle and into his arms. He scraped away the dirt, revealing a thick, galvanized pipe running vertically into the darkness. "I found the pipe," Leo called out. "Well, don't just stare at it. Clear the blockage. Hit it if you have to. Probably just a rust buildup." Leo sighed and grabbed a heavy wrench from his tool belt. He knelt in the dirt, the smell of wet earth filling his nose. He gave the pipe a solid, frustrated whack. Clang. Down in the dark, the sound was like a church bell. I jumped to my feet. The vibration traveled down the ventilation shaft, amplified by the metal acoustics. Someone was there. Someone was digging. I grabbed the metal bar I had pried from the bed frame years ago, my writing tool, my weapon. I rushed to the intake vent in the ceiling corner. I couldn't shout. The soundproofing was too thick, but sound travels through solids. Physics. I reached up and struck the metal ductwork. I didn't strike it randomly. Random noise is nature. Branches falling, pipes settling. Intelligence is pattern. Intelligence is repetition. 3 sharp strikes. Pause. 3 sharp strikes. Pause. 3 sharp strikes. SOS, the universal cry of the lost. Leo froze. His wrench hovered in the air. The sound coming from the pipe wasn't an echo, it was rhythmic, metallic, deliberate. Clang, clang, clang. He frowned, leaning his ear closer to the cold metal. "Hello?" he whispered, feeling foolish. Clang, clang, clang. A chill shivered down Leo's spine that had nothing to do with the sweat cooling on his back. He looked over his shoulder at the house. The rich guy was gone, probably to refill his drink. He looked back at the pipe. It went deep, way deeper than a drainage pipe should go, and the sound, it was coming from below. He gripped his wrench and tapped back. Shave and a haircut. Tap, 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 tap. He waited. From the depths of the earth, the answer came, faint but unmistakable. Tap, tap. Leo scrambled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't fixing a drain. He was standing on top of a cage. He looked at the house, looming large and silent in the afternoon sun, and for the first time he noticed the cameras. They weren't pointed at the gates. They were pointed at the garden. He swallowed hard, his mind racing. He needed to leave. He needed to get his money and run. But then the tapping came again, faster this time, desperate. SOS, SOS, SOS. Leo looked at the shovel, then at the pipe, and then at the wrapper of the sandwich he had eaten for lunch in his pocket. He was just a day laborer. He wasn't a hero, but he knew what he heard. He glanced at the patio doors. Empty. Leo pulled a Sharpie from his pocket. He used it to mark lumber and grabbed the sandwich wrapper. He flattened the grease-streaked paper against his knee. He didn't know who was down there, but he knew they were alive. He wrote 3 words in jagged, frantic block letters. I hear you. He scanned the pipe. There was a seam near the joint, a small gap where the rust had eaten through, likely the source of the air failure. It was barely a sliver, but it was enough. He rolled the paper into a tight, thin needle. He jammed it in the crock in the pipe and pushed it down with a piece of wire. He felt it slip. Gravity took over. Hey, what are you doing down there? Leo jumped. Dane was standing directly above him on the edge of the trench, eyes narrowed, the ice in his glass clinking. Just checking the structural integrity, sir, Leo lied, his voice cracking. Found the clog. I think I cleared it. Dane stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. Then he sneered. Good, fill it in, and be quick about it. I have guests coming. Leo grabbed his shovel, his hands trembling. He began to throw the dirt back into the hole, burying the pipe, burying the secret. But as the earth covered the metal, he swore he could still feel the vibration in the soles of his boots. A rhythm, a heartbeat, a plea. The greasy sandwich wrapper fluttered down the dark throat of the ventilation pipe like a dying moth, landing softly on the concrete floor at my feet. I stared at it, my breath hitched in my throat, afraid that if I exhaled, the paper would vanish like a mirage. I picked it up with trembling fingers. In the dim emergency light, the jagged Sharpie letters screamed reality I had ceased to believe in. I hear you. 3 words, a universe of difference. For 20 years, I had been a ghost screaming into the void. Now, the void had answered, but I knew the window was closing. The vibration of the shovel above had stopped, but the heavy thud of Dane's footsteps was still audible, pacing the perimeter. I needed to send a message back, but I couldn't shout. The soundproofing would swallow my voice, or worse, the cameras would pick up the audio spike and alert Meredith before the stranger could act. I needed physical proof. I scrambled to my stash, a hollowed-out cavity behind the toilet unit where I kept my archive of trash. I pulled out a silver foil wrapper from a protein bar, the only sustenance Meredith had provided for the last week. It was crinkled and sticky, but the underside was reflective, metallic. I grabbed the sharpened screw I used for my wall calculations. I didn't have time for poetry. I needed data. I pressed the screw into the foil, etching the letters deep enough to tear the surface but not the structure. Not dead. Imprisoned. Elias Sterling. Tulian. I rolled the foil into a tight, dense cylinder. Now came the impossible part. Gravity was my enemy. I looked up at the intake vent. The fan was dead, the housing stripped during my years of tinkering. I had harvested the copper wiring from the motor months ago, intending to build a makeshift heater. Now it was my lifeline. I grabbed the bundle of stiff copper wire, hastily twisting the strands together to form a semi-rigid rod. It was flimsy, barely 6 feet long, but I knew the acoustics. The breach the stranger had found was low, near the elbow of the intake, likely where the pipe turned to run under the garden foundation. I stood on my cot, my muscles coiled, and fed the wire up into the dark shaft, the silver message hooked onto the end like a desperate lure. Above ground, Leo was sweating through his shirt. He had shoveled 2 scoops of dirt back into the trench when Dane's voice cut through the afternoon heat. Faster, kid. I don't pay by the hour. Dane was standing 10 feet away, his back turned, tapping furiously on his phone. Leo hesitated. The tapping from the pipe had stopped, replaced by a strange scraping sound. Scritch, scritch, like a rat clawing its way up. Leo glanced at the security camera mounted on the eaves of the pool house. It was swiveling, its black eye sweeping the garden. He shifted his stance, blocking the trench from the camera's line of sight with his body. He looked down into the hole. Something was poking out of the rust fracture in the pipe, a twisted copper wire shaking violently, and hooked onto the end was a piece of trash. Hey, Dane snapped, turning around. What's the holdup? Leo's heart slammed against his ribs. He dropped to his knees, feigning a stumble. Just, dropped my water bottle, sir. Sorry. With a sleight of hand born from years of avoiding trouble, Leo reached into the muddy trench. He grabbed the wire. It tugged back for a second, a resistance from the darkness below, before he yanked the foil note free. He crushed the silver ball into his palm, the sharp edges digging into his skin, and shoved his fist into his pocket. Clumsy, Dane sneered, taking a sip of his drink. Finish it, now. Leo nodded, keeping his head down. He grabbed the shovel and began to fill the hole with a manic energy, burying the pipe, the wire, and the man beneath the earth. He didn't tap back. He couldn't risk it. He just filled the grave and prayed. 40 minutes later, Leo sat in the cab of his beat-up Ford Ranger parked in the far corner of a 7-Eleven 3 miles from the Sterling estate. His hands were shaking so bad he could barely unroll the foil. He smoothed out the wrapper on the dashboard. The etched letters caught the sunlight. Not dead. Imprisoned. Elias Sterling. Tell Julian. Leo stared at the name. Elias Sterling. The name sounded familiar, like something from a history book or a trivia game. He pulled out his cracked iPhone and typed it into the search bar. The results flooded the screen. The disgraced tycoon, the embolizer who vanished, 20th anniversary of Sterling scandal. He clicked on the Images tab. He saw photos of a younger, softer man in a tuxedo, smiling next to the blonde woman who had watched him from the patio window earlier. Then he saw the age progression sketches the news sometimes ran. But the face in his mind wasn't a sketch. It was the feeling of that wire, the desperation of the tapping. Tell Julian, he whispered. He searched Julian Sterling. The results were different. Assistant U.S. Attorney Julian Sterling. Federal prosecutor targeting organized crime. The son who stayed. Leo looked at the phone, then at the foil wrapper. He was a guy who fixed drains and smoked too much weed. He wasn't a whistleblower. If you went to the cops, that rich lady and her boyfriend would crush him. They probably own the cops. But if you went to the Sun... He found the number for the U.S. Attorney's office in the city. It was a general line. He hit dial before he could talk himself out of it. U.S. Attorney's office, how may I direct your call? I need to talk to Julian Sterling, Leo said, his voice raspy. Mr. Sterling is in court today. Would you like to leave a voicemail on his general line? No, Leo said, gripping the steering wheel. No voicemail. You tell him I have a message from the ghost in the basement. Tell him I found his dad. There was a long pause on the other end. Sir, making false reports to a federal office is I have his handwriting, Leo shouted, surprising himself, on a protein bar wrapper. Look, just tell him the drainage pipe in the garden isn't a drain. It's a cage. And tell Eli says he's not dead. He hung up. He stared at the phone, terrified. He started the truck, the engine sputtering to life. He didn't go home. He didn't go to his next job. He drove to the public library, found a corner with no cameras, and sat there clutching a piece of foil, waiting for the world to explode. Across the city, inside the glass and steel fortress of the federal courthouse, Julian Sterling walked out of courtroom 4B, loosening his tie. He was 30 years old, with the same sharp jawline as his mother, but the dark, brooding eyes of the father he tried to forget. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his secretary. A text, urgent, credible tip regarding the disappearance. Call me back. Julian stopped in the middle of the hallway. He'd heard tips for 20 years. Psychics, conspiracy theorists, extortionists. He usually deleted them, but the word credible was not one his secretary used lightly. He dialed. What is it, Sarah? A kid called, Sarah said, low her voice. He sounded terrified. He didn't ask for money. He just said he was working at the estate today. Julian, he said he has a note from Elias. It's a hoax, Julian said, his stomach tightening. My father is in the Paymans, drinking margaritas. He mentioned the wrapper, Sarah pressed. He said it was etched, and he said something else. He said the drainage pipe isn't a drain. Julian, didn't you tell me once that the only thing your father actually built with his own hands was the storm shelter? Julian went cold. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Him, 5 years old, holding the flashlight while his dad showed him the ventilation schematics. "It's our secret fort, Jules, safe from anything." "Where is this kid?" Julian asked, his voice deadly quiet. "He's at the downtown library. He's scared to leave." Julian turned around, walking away from the elevators and towards the exit. "Call the tactical team. Tell them I want a breach warrant for the Sterling estate. And Sarah, tell them to bring the heavy cutters." The convoy of block SUVs did not slow down as it approached the wrought iron gates of the Sterling estate. There was no buzzing of the intercom, no polite request for entry. The lead vehicle, a reinforced tactical truck, simply rammed the locking mechanism. Metal shrieked against metal, a violent overture to the justice that was about to be served. The gates swung open, bent and defeated, allowing the federal task force to swarm the long, manicured driveway. Julian Sterling sat in the passenger seat of the second vehicle, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. He stared at the house, the sprawling mansion of limestone and glass that had starred in his nightmares for 2 decades. It looked exactly the same as the day his mother had told him his father was a thief. The hydrangeas were in bloom. The fountain was running. It was a perfect, pristine lie. "We have the perimeter," the team lead, Agent Miller, said into his radio. "Principal target is in the sunroom. Secondary target is by the pool." "Secure them," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "But don't let them talk. I don't want to hear a single word until I open that door." The team breached the front door with a battering ram, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Julian stepped into the foyer, flanked by armed agents. The house smelled of lavender and expensive polish, a sickeningly sweet mask for the rot beneath. Meredith appeared at the top of the grand staircase, a glass of Chardonnay halfway to her mouth. She froze. For a second, she looked like the imperious queen she had always been, annoyed by a delivery man. Then she saw the FBI windbreakers. She saw the weapons. And finally, she saw her son. "Julian?" she gasped, her face draining of color. "What on earth is going on? We have guests coming in an hour." "Get down," an agent shouted, moving up the stairs. "Don't touch me," Meredith shrieked, backing away. "This is harassment. Julian, tell them to stop. Tell them who I am." Julian didn't look at her. He walked past the agents, restraining a struggling, cursing Dane in the hallway. He walked straight to the double doors on the west wing, the library. He pushed the doors open. The room was unrecognizable from his childhood. The warm mahogany and leather were gone, replaced with cold white marble and modern art. It felt like a mausoleum. "Bring the sledgehammers," Julian ordered. Meredith was dragged into the room by 2 agents, her heels skidding on the floor. "Julian, stop this. You're destroying the foundation. You're having a psychotic break, just like your father." Julian turned to her slowly. The silence in the room was absolute. "My father didn't have a break, Mother. He had a wife." He pointed to the center of the room, to the expensive Persian rug that Dane had bought with stolen money. "Move it." The agents rolled back the rug. Beneath it, the floor was a seamless expanse of white marble. There was no handle, no seam, just solid stone. "You see?" Meredith laughed, a high, brittle sound that bordered on hysteria. "There's nothing there. It's just a floor. You're embarrassing yourself." Julian looked at the floor. He remembered the diagram the gardener, Leo, had described. The drainage pipe is a cage. If the ventilation was in the garden, the box was here. "Break it," Julian said. "Sir?" Agent Miller hesitated. "That's 2 inches of stone. If we're wrong—" "I said break it," Julian roared, the veneer of the prosecutor crocking to reveal the terrified son beneath. "Smash it all to hell." The first sledgehammer swung down. Crack! A spiderweb of white lines appeared on the pristine surface. Meredith flinched as if she had been struck. Crack! Chunks of marble flew. Dust rose in the air. The agents took turns, the rhythmic pounding filling the house. It took 10 minutes of brutal labor to clear the stone. And there, beneath the rubble and the bonding cement, was the old wooden subfloor. And cut into the wood was a square outline. A trap door. Meredith slumped against the wall, her legs giving out. She didn't scream anymore. She just stared at the floor with dead, shark-like eyes. Julian fell to his knees, ignoring the sharp shards of stone digging into his suit pants. He clawed at the wood, ripping away the splintered planks. Beneath the wood was steel, a heavy reinforced hatch secured by 3 gold padlocks, aged and tarnished but still holding strong. "The cutters," Julian whispered. An agent stepped forward with hydraulic bolt cutters. The jaws clamped around the first shackle. The metal groaned, then snapped. 1. Julian's heart hammered against his ribs, mirroring the pounding he had heard in his head for years. Was he too late? Was he about to open a tomb? The second lock snapped. The third. Julian grabbed a cold steel handle. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip it. He looked back at Meredith. "Pray," he said to her. "Pray he's alive, because if he isn't, I will bury you in this hole myself." He pulled. The hinges shrieked, a rusty, agonizing scream of metal that hadn't moved in 20 years. The door opened, revealing a gaping black maw. A blast of air hit them. It smelled of stagnant water, ozone, and unwashed humanity. "Dad?" Julian called out, his voice cracking. "Dad?" Silence. Then, from the darkness, a sound. Not a scream, not a cry. A number. 4,100. Prime. Julian grabbed a tactical flashlight and jumped into the hole. He didn't wait for the ladder. He dropped 10 feet, landing hard on the concrete floor. The beam of light cut through the gloom. It swept across walls covered in white scratches. Thousands of equations, a chaotic symphony of math swirling around the room. And there, in the center of the cell, standing tall despite his emaciated frame, was a man. He had a beard that reached his chest, gray and matted. His skin was paper white, but his eyes were sharp, alert. Elias blinked in the sudden brightness. He raised a hand to shield his face. He didn't look like the soft man in the tuxedo photos. He looked like a prophet who had survived the desert. "Julian?" Elias rasped. Julian rushed forward, closing the distance that 20 years of lies had created. He grabbed his father, pulling the frail, trembling body into a crushing embrace. Elias felt like bird bones and wire, but he held on with a surprising strength. "I knew," Elias whispered into his son's shoulder, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. "I calculated the probability. I knew you'd come." "I'm sorry," Julian sobbed, burying his face in his father's ragged shirt. "I'm so sorry I believed her." "Variable excluded," Elias murmured, stroking his son's hair just as he had when Julian was 5. "The equation is balanced now. I'm here. I'm here." Above them, the agent swarmed the opening, weapons trained on the opening, securing the scene. But down in the concrete box, time stopped. The lock was broken. The variable was solved. Elias Sterling looked up at the square of light cutting through the darkness, and for the first time in 7,304 days, he didn't just see a light bulb. He saw the sky. The sunlight was not a warm embrace. It was a radiation burn. For the first week, I couldn't open my eyes without searing pain, my pupils having dilated permanently to accommodate the gloom of the bunker. I lived behind heavy blackout curtains in a private wing of St. Jude's Hospital, huddled under sterile blankets that felt too soft, too light compared to the damp wool I was used to. The doctors treated me like an archaeological discovery, a biological anomaly that defied medical textbooks. They spoke in hushed tones outside my door, but I heard them. I heard everything. My hearing, honed by 2 decades of tracking footsteps through concrete, picked up the scratch of a pen on a clipboard 3 rooms away. "Severe muscular atrophy," Dr. Aris muttered to Julian. "Bone density comparable to an 80-year-old. Vitamin D deficiency so profound it's a miracle his heart kept beating. And the skin, it's like parchment. One wrong touch and he bleeds." "He's alive." Julian's voice was hard, defensive. "That's what matters." "Physically, yes," the doctor hesitated, "but psychologically? 20 years in solitary confinement, Julian. The human mind isn't designed for that. We need to prepare for permanent psychosis, dissociation. He might not be the man you remember. But I was exactly the man he remembered. In fact, I was more. The soft, conflict-averse Elias was gone, burned away by the dark. What remained was distilled essence, pure logic. Well, I relearned how to walk, taking trembling steps that felt like navigating the surface of the moon. Meredith was launching her counteroffensive. She had been arrested, released on a $50 million bond paid for with my assets, and had immediately hired the most vicious PR firm in the country. I watched her on the television in my hospital room. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a victim. She sat in a pastoral garden setting, wearing white, her hands clasped in her lap. She was playing the saint of the Sterling estate. Elias didn't disappear. He broke. 20 years ago, the pressure of the company became too much. He started hallucinating, seeing enemies everywhere. He begged me to build him a safe place, a sanctuary. She wiped a tear. I didn't imprison him. I protected him. He refused to come out. He was dangerous to himself and the children. I sacrificed my life, my happiness to keep his secret and keep him safe. And now the world calls me a villain for loving a sick man. It was a brilliant lie. It used the physical evidence, the panic room I had designed, against me. It explained why I was alive and fed. It painted her as a tragic guardian and me as a lunatic who had locked himself away. The public, fickle and hungry for drama, began to sway. Could it be true, the pundits asked? Why would she keep him alive if she wanted him gone? Julian stormed into my room, throwing his tablet onto the bed. She's winning, Dad. The narrative is shifting. Her lawyers are filing motions to have you declared mentally incompetent. They want to seal the evidence from the bunker, claiming it's the ramblings of a madman and violates your medical privacy. I sat up, the motor of the hospital bed whirring. I reached for the tablet with a hand that looked like a claw, the knuckles swollen, the nail fingers brittle. Let me see. Don't watch it, Julian warned. I'm not watching her, I rasped, my voice gaining strength every day. I'm watching the timeline. I scrolled through the news cycle, the doubt, the spin, the insanity defense. Meredith was betting on the fact that no one could prove what happened behind a locked steel door for 7,300 days. She was betting on my silence. I said she lost her mind, I said, looking up at my son. She says the room was a padded cell for a broken mind. We know it's a lie, Julian said, but without witnesses. We have witnesses, Julian. We have thousands of them. Who? The walls. I instructed Julian to release the forensic photos of the bunker, not just the wide shots of the squalor, but the macro shots, the high-resolution images of the equations I had carved on the concrete. The next day, we held a press conference. I couldn't attend in person, my immune system was too weak, but I live-streamed from the hospital. The world tuned in to see the mole man, expecting a gibbering wreck. Instead, they saw me, shaved, sitting upright, wearing a suit that hung loosely on my skeletal frame, but looking into the camera with eyes that burned with a terrifying intelligence. Meredith claims I lost my mind, I said, my voice low and steady. She claims I locked myself in. But a madman scribbles nonsense. A scientist records data. Behind me on a massive screen, the photos of my cell appeared, the white scratches on the gray walls. This, I pointed to a section of the wall near the floor, is the derivation of the Navier-Stokes existence and smoothness problem. I solved it in year 6. The image shifted. This is a calendar, not of days, but of events. Events I could only know if I was listening. Events Meredith and Dane discussed when standing on the floor above my head. I picked up a sheaf of papers, my translation of the wall markings. On November 4th, 2008, Meredith complained that the Pinot Noir was corked and threw the bottle into the fireplace. I heard the glass shatter at 8:43 p.m. She then told Dane that she had forged my signature to liquidate the bond holdings for Julian's trust fund. I looked at the camera. On July 12, 2014, Dane came home drunk. He was limping. He told Meredith he had torn his meniscus skiing in Aspen. He laughed and said at least the old man is paying for the surgery. The feed cut to a medical record Julian had subpoenaed. Dane's knee surgery, dated July 14, 2014, paid for by the Sterling Family Trust. I know about the abortion in 2009, I continued, relentless. I know about the bribe paid to the zoning commissioner in 2016 to hide the ventilation modifications. I know that on Christmas Eve 2019, Meredith stood directly above my air intake and told her lover that she wished I would just hurry up and die so they could sell the estate. The silence in the room and across the millions of screens watching was absolute. These are the scrawls of not a madman, I finished, leaning into the lens. These are the court transcripts of a 20-year trial. I was the stenographer, I was the jury, and now I am the executioner. The insanity defense evaporated in seconds. The public didn't see a sick man anymore. They saw a genius who had been buried alive and spent every waking second sharpening his mind into a blade. Meredith's PR team resigned within the hour. The spin was dead, the unraveling had begun, and the threads of her life were being pulled apart, one calculated datum at a time. I lay back against the pillows, exhausted but victorious. I had used the darkness to see the truth, and now the light was shining on everything she had tried to hide. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish, old wood, and the stale sweat of desperation. It was a scent I had never encountered in the bunker, where the air was always recycled and sterile. From my seat in the front row of the gallery, flanked by Julian and a team of federal marshals, I observed the final act of the tragedy Meredith had written. For 20 years, I had been the captive audience. Today, I was the critic. The trial had lasted 3 weeks, a parade of forensic accountants, structural engineers, and medical experts who dissected the architecture of my misery. But the climax wasn't the evidence, it was the cannibalism. Meredith and Dane, the lovers who had once toasted to my ghost with my own champagne, were now seated at separate defense tables, separated by 10 feet of aisle and an ocean of hate. The prisoner's dilemma is a standard concept in game theory. 2 conspirators are arrested. If both stay silent, they get light sentences. If one betrays the other, the betrayer goes free while the other rots. If both betray each other, they both lose. Meredith and Dane were not logicians. They were narcissists. And narcissists always try to save themselves. It was his idea, Meredith shrieked, shattering the decorum of the court. She stood up, her perfectly tailored white suit now looking like a costume on a fraying marionette. She pointed a trembling finger at Dane. He was the one who drugged him. He told me Elias was dead. He said he buried the body and then he forced me to sign those papers. I was a hostage in my own home, Your Honor. I was terrified of him. Dane didn't just sit there. The arrogant swagger I had heard in his footsteps for 2 decades was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a trapped rat. He slammed his fist on the table. You lying witch! You hired me! You handed me the syringe! You told me he was worth more as a memory than a husband. He turned to the jury, sweat slicking his forehead. She planned it all, the bunker, the embezzlement story, the fake passport. She made me do the renovations to hide the noise. She threatened to frame me if I ever left. I was just the hired help. I watched them tear at each other, fascinated. It was a chaotic, ugly equation solving itself in real time. Every accusation they hurled was a confession. They were doing the prosecution's job for them, dismantling the love that had cost me 20 years of sunlight. When the foreman of the jury stood up to read the verdict, the room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the HVAC system, a sound that used to trigger panic attacks, but now just sounded like a machine doing its job. We find the defendant, Meredith Sterling, guilty on all counts: first-degree kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, grand larceny, and fraud. We find the defendant, Dane Miller, guilty on all counts. Meredith let out a sound that wasn't human, a low, keen wail of disbelief. She looked back at the gallery, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto mine. For a second, I saw the woman I had married, the woman I had trusted with my life. She looked small. She mouthed the word, "Please." I didn't smile. I didn't frown. I simply looked at her with the same detachment I had used to calculate the flow rate of the ventilation pipes. She was a variable that had been solved. She was a remainder. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for theatrics, adjusted her glasses. "Meredith Sterling, you stole a life. You buried a human being beneath the floorboards of luxury and spent his fortune while he withered in the dark. The cruelty required to maintain such a deception for 20 years is beyond the court's comprehension. I sentence you to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. And you, Mr. Miller," she turned to Dane, who was weeping into his hands. "You were the jailer. You heard him tapping. You heard him living, and you poured another drink. Life in prison, consecutive sentences." The gavel came down. It was a sharp, final sound, better than the click of a padlock. As the bailiffs moved in to handcuff them, Meredith lunged, not at me, but at Dane. She clawed at his face, screaming obscenities until she was dragged away, kicking and screaming out the side door. She didn't look back at me again. She didn't look back at Julian. She was gone, erased from the equation just as she had tried to erase me. "It's over, Dad," Julian said, whispering, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Yes," I said, my voice rough but steady. "The math checks out." We walked down the center aisle, the reporters shouting questions from behind the bar, the cameras flashing like strobe lights. I ignored them. I focused on the movement of my legs, the strength returning to my calves, the rhythmic tap of my cane on the floor. I wasn't walking to escape. I was walking to arrive. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse swung open. I stopped. After 7,300 days of artificial fluorescence, of gray concrete and shadows, the world outside was an explosion of color. The sky was a blue so deep it hurt my chest. The trees in the plaza were a vibrant, impossible green. And the sun? The sun was a physical weight, a warm blanket that wrapped around my cold bones. I closed my eyes and lifted my face to the heat. I breathed air that smelled of exhaust fumes, hot asphalt, and coffee, the most beautiful perfume I had ever known. "Dad?" Julian's voice was gentle. "There's someone here to meet you." I opened my eyes. Standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps, shielded from the press by a wall of Julian's security detail, was a young woman holding the hand of a small boy. "This is Sarah," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "My wife. And this..." The little boy looked about 5 years old, the same age Julian was when the door locked. He had messy hair and curious eyes, clutching a toy robot. He looked at me with a mixture of shyness and awe. "This is Elias," Julian said. "We named him after you. We told him Grandpa was on a very long trip." I dropped my cane. I didn't need it. I fell to my knees on the hot concrete, ignoring the pain, and held out my arms. The little boy hesitated for a second, then ran to me. I caught him. He felt solid and warm and real. He smelled of baby shampoo and sunshine. I buried my face in his small neck, and for the first time since the night of the roast duck and the drugged wine, I wept. Not tears of despair, not tears of rage, but tears of pure, unadulterated gratitude. Meredith had stolen 20 years. She had taken my career, my home, and the prime of my life. But as I held my grandson in the sunlight, surrounded by the noise of a city that had forgotten me and then found me again, I knew the truth. She hadn't taken everything. She had left me the future. And as I looked up at the infinite, cloudless sky, I knew I had plenty of time left to count the blessings.